She stumped up to the water's edge with a folder in her hand, sunglasses glinting in the afternoon sun, a sour expression on her face. She didn't knock. She didn't say hello. She pointed straight at my boat and barked out the sentence that would launch the battle of a lifetime. You need to remove that immediately. You're violating HOA watercraft rules. You have 48 hours or we start fining you $500 a day. I stood there for a moment, stunned. Was this some kind of joke? My boat had been docked there for years. It wasn't an eyesore. It wasn't loud. It was mine. Passed down from my grandfather, restored lovingly by hand, every plank sealed with memory. And more importantly, that boat was floating on something far more personal than water. It was my lake, but that's the funny thing about HOAs. They operate like tiny kingdoms. A few people get a taste of authority and suddenly believe they can rewrite history. They didn't knock on my door to ask questions. They didn't try to understand. No, they came in swinging, ready to assert dominance. But what they didn't realize was that I wasn't just a guy with a boat. I was the guy who owned the lake. Let me back up. My family bought this land in the 1950s, back before the paved roads, before the developments, before the coffee shops and golf carts and community newsletters. Just raw land, thick trees, and a beautiful body of water tucked right in the center of it all. My grandfather found it on a fishing trip, fell in love with it, and spent nearly his entire savings securing the parcel. Back then, it was just wilderness. Over the years, they built a small cabin, then a dock, then a boathouse, then they restored an old rowboat and named it June, after my grandmother. That boat was magic. My father told me stories of lying in it under the stars, listening to crickets, watching fireworks reflect off the lake in the summer. It was more than just a thing, it was a living memory. Eventually, development crept in, the city expanded, land got bought up, and before long, developers were knocking on the door. They wanted to build a neighborhood around the lake. My grandfather, sharp and savvy, agreed, but with one condition. The lake itself would remain in our name. They could build around it, they could form their associations. But the water, the shoreline, ours. Fast forward, decades later. The developers are long gone, and now the HOA thinks they run the show. Somewhere along the way, the lines blurred for them. They assumed, they ignored the past. And now, a clipboard-wielding woman in heels was telling me to move my boat. I laughed at first honestly. I thought it was a misunderstanding. But the next day, I got a formal letter. Certified mail. HOA. Letterhead. Immediate action required, in bold, across the top. They cited a list of community bylaws, claimed I was in violation of 5 separate articles, and threatened escalating fines. And they added something new, a threat of legal action. I sat down at my desk, unfolded the old property folder, and spread the documents out. I hadn't looked at them in years. My hands moved over the faded surveys, the notarized deeds, the land maps. Everything was still in order. My name, my family trust, and right there in black and white, ownership of Lake Hadley in 150 feet, shoreline surrounding water body to remain under private control, an exemption from HOA jurisdiction. There it was. Proof. Legal proof that not only did I not answer to the HOA, they had absolutely no authority over the lake at all. I sent them a copy. I even highlighted the relevant parts, added a letter explaining the history. I thought, surely, this will settle it. It's just a mistake. But they doubled down. They told me the documents were incomplete and unclear. They said the rules had evolved, that all common areas were governed by HOA law now, regardless of history. They sent another letter, this one more aggressive. They gave me 1 week to remove the boat or face formal legal action. It wasn't a mistake anymore. It was a challenge. I called a meeting with the HOA board. I brought a real estate lawyer. I brought copies of every document, survey, plat map, historical transaction. I even brought an old photo of my grandfather on the dock, holding up a base with the boat in the background. They didn't care. The president, Ms. Sutton, the same woman who marched to my dock, leaned back in her chair and said, regardless of what you believe you own, the current board has jurisdiction over all shared resources, and that includes the lake. My lawyer calmly responded, that's not what the law says, and not what the title says. If you'd like to contest this, we're happy to proceed to court. The room went dead silent. Ms. Sutton's jaw clenched. Another board member shifted uncomfortably in his seat. They knew they'd gone too far, but their pride wouldn't let them back down. They left the meeting saying they'd consider the documents, but the next day, I received another notice. Same threat. Same deadline. It was war. So I took the next step. I filed a cease and desist. I barred any HOA member from stepping on my shoreline. I posted legal signage around the lake perimeter. And then, I did the unthinkable. I revoked the HOA's license to hold fishing events on my lake. You should have seen the look on their faces. Fishing had been a tradition in the community. Every month, families gathered at the dock for barbecues and tournaments. But it had always been unofficial, granted by my family's kindness, not by any written agreement. And now, that privilege was gone. Parents were upset. Kids confused. HOA members furious. But I made it clear, I wasn't punishing the community. I was standing up to the bullies who thought they could rewrite history with a clipboard and a condescending tone. And then came the apology. Quiet, hesitant. Ms. Sutton emailed me, asking for a resolution. I said sure, I'd allow access to the lake for events again, but under a signed agreement, acknowledging my ownership and permanently removing any enforcement claims over the lake or the shoreline. The board reluctantly agreed. Things changed. After that, the notices stopped, the patrols stopped, the fake fines were dropped, and suddenly, people in the neighborhood started waving again. I got letters from neighbors thanking me. One man told me he'd been threatened by the HOA over planting wildflowers in his own yard. Another said they'd been fined $100 for a trampoline. We started meeting quietly, sharing stories. It wasn't just me they were targeting. We began forming a coalition, not an HOA club, just neighbors looking out for each other. And from then on, every time the HOA tried something unfair, there was pushback. They lost control of the narrative. And I kept my boat. Every morning, I walk down to that dock with a cup of coffee and breathe in the smell of pine and lake water. I run my hand along the hull of June and I remember my grandfather's laugh, my father's stories, and the feeling of freedom that water always brought us. This wasn't about a boat. This was about respect, about history, about not being bullied into silence by people who think rules outweigh reason. They thought I was just some guy with a boat. They had no idea I held the deed to their centerpiece. So here's what I'll leave you with. Sometimes, the quietest person holds the deepest power. They ordered me to move my boat, not knowing I owned the lake. But when the truth came out, they lost control, and I found strength. Where they saw rules and control, I saw history and ownership. When they threatened, I stood firm. In the end, I didn't just keep a boat, I reclaimed respect. I reclaimed voice. I reminded them and myself that when you know your worth, you never have to bow. Know your rights, read the fine print, trust your instincts, and never, ever back down from what's yours. Because sometimes, one boat on a lake is stronger than an entire boardroom of bullies.